Avis, cette capsule a été produite simultanément en français et en anglais. Notice, this episode was produced simultaneously in English and French. Vous écoutez présentement la version anglaise. You are currently watching the English version.
Hello and welcome to STereotypic STeist. I'm your host, Guy from the other day. Today, you're in for a treat. Not only am I going to talk about one of the best classic point-and-click adventure games, but it's also a request from one of my patrons because they get to pick first regarding which game to talk about in upcoming episodes. It's no mystery that this game is The Secret of Monkey Island, developed and published by Lucasfilm Games in 1990, also in 1991 for the ST version. Before digging into the game, I'd like to thank my patrons via Patreon. Consider supporting me if you like what I do. Also, I invite you to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and to join me on my Facebook group. Now, on to Monkey Island.
The game is so classic and well documented that it needs no introduction. Plus, there are so many YouTube clips about it that I'm probably going to repeat things you already know, or perhaps not. We must first consider where we are starting from. In 1990, it had been a short while since we had abandoned the command parser. Some of the later games that used it include Sierra Online's King's Quest IV, released in 1988. On the Lucasfilm Games side, we were already using the SCUM engine introduced in Maniac Mansion, originally released in 1987. SCUM stands for Script Creation Utility for Maniac Mansion. It's a cross-platform engine, that is to say that it can be ported to other systems or even other games of the same type or genre with the same functionalities. Zach McCracken, published in 1988, makes use of it. We can therefore presume the influence it had on other games of the same category. Regarding Delphin Software, for instance, for Operation Stealth, published in 1990, a menu with simplified actions appear when necessary, while at the bottom of the screen the chosen command is displayed. As for Sierra Online, for the King's Quest franchise, we notice from the fifth opus published in 1990 that the command parser has given way to a mouse pointer that changes appearance depending on the desired action. No doubt it was for the best. Text-based adventure games were in decline then, even those with spectacular visuals. The command prompt was as much about giving the impression of being in control as being left to our own devices.
I still really liked investigation, adventure, and puzzle games at that time. It's not that I got tired of them, but they are generally very linear, i.e. you have to do X to be able to go from Y to Z.
And Monkey Island is no exception. There aren't that many point-and-click games that are also open world. I mention Myst, by the way, because it's one example among a few others, like Riven, the sequel to Myst, or Beyond a Steel Sky.
Getting back to Monkey Island, the synopsis boils down to this. You play as Guybrush Threepwood, who arrives to Melee Island in the hope of becoming a pirate. It's a MacGuffin.
For this, he will have to, that is to say, you will have to complete 3 missions or overcome 3 trials, which are only the first part of the adventure, because in fact the game is divided into 3 chapters. I won't take much time to explain them one by one, considering that the solution to the game is known and well documented. I will therefore focus my attention on the game itself, in this case the ST adaptation. This is the structure of the hero's quest, if you will, where the protagonist will undergo a major change, let's say. It's full of winks and Easter eggs, with humor both in the behavior of the characters and in the dialogues, with lines worthy of a comedy show, insults and retorts just as clever.
Because the saber or sword combat system is done using insults and retorts.
The game was originally designed to be played on PCs running DOS with CGA/EGA graphics cards, the latter usually capable of displaying 16 fixed colors, not to mention a few sound cards at the time. Considering that VGA cards already existed, I wonder why we wouldn't have opted for the VGA display, which was backward compatible with EGA and CGA modes.
At least I think it was developed for the EGA/CGA mode because of the original game box, which specifically mentions 16 colors even in VGA mode.
Regardless, Monkey Island in its 256-color VGA version is one of the first games I played on my DX2. I didn't even know at the time that there was an EGA/CGA version. I didn't own a Roland MT32 sound module, but I did have a Sound Blaster card, so that's about the playing experience I had initially. The good thing about the EGA mode is that the adaptation for the Atari ST was quite easy from a visual standpoint, and that goes for the music. We could certainly have done better, like changing the color assignment in the palette during the vertical blank to show more than 16, or sticking to 16 but with nuances from one screen to another. Oh well, the beginning of the 1990s was decisive for the ST series, which was then falling behind in its original version compared to its rivals, starting with the Amiga, which was superior to it in almost all aspects, not to mention PCs running DOS, for which more and more games were designed with the VGA mode in mind, along with digitized sounds via the Sound Blaster card. In this sense, the Amiga version constitutes a sort of compromise between the VGA version and the ST version, firstly because it can display 32 colors out of 4096, also because it offers some digitized sound effects.
As for many games of the time, Monkey Island works a lot by more or less fixed screens with some elements in the background and others in the foreground, animations, sprites of all sizes, as well as some scaling regarding the latter.
The topic of scaling is that at one time we didn't do any of it, and to show character sprites at a certain distance, we used an element in the foreground to hide the transition. In Cruise for a Corpse, on the other hand, the transition is gradual, depending on the distance that separates the protagonist from the observer. It's well thought out, but it takes a lot of CPU cycles if you do it on the fly, although the protagonist in this specific case is not a sprite per se, but rather a 3D object composed of a set of polygons. It's the same principle as in Alone in the Dark, published a few years later. It's definitely not a point-and-click game, and the camera angles aren't the same, but like in Cruise for a Corpse, the protagonist is made up of a set of polygons. Otherwise, the combination of foreground and background elements was common at the time, especially since King's Quest I, to name only that, and now we couldn't do without it for adventure games with on-screen sprites. Later we would add parallax effects and scaling.
The sets or screens or scenes were the work of artists. Everything was usually drawn using software, one stroke at a time, one color at a time, sometimes one pixel at a time.
By default, the scene constitutes a background image, literally in the background at the address F0000 for a 1040 ST. As I've often said, the ST's screen memory works in 32-bit clusters for 8 pixels at low resolution. To determine whether or not to display a sprite, we take into account its X and Y coordinate in the playing area. The sprite is always on the physical screen at the address F8000, but you can restrict its visibility by bringing back elements of the background on this same physical screen above the sprite around the area where it's located, if necessary. Also, it's not talked about often, but the dialogues are superimposed on the image on the physical screen, and the space needed for each of the letters changes somewhat depending on the width of the letter. The letter I, for example, is narrower than the letters M and W. However, traditionally in text mode, each of the letters, or even each of the ASCII characters, measures the same number of pixels. To display text that takes into account the relative width of the letters with a transparency effect, we send the text to a routine that converts it into an image, which we will then copy and paste onto the physical screen. Another innovation, say, from Lucasfilm Games is that dying is virtually impossible, especially in Monkey Island, a response to Sierra Online games where death can occur in any set or screen. In this respect, I indulge myself in watching some episodes of Pushing Up Roses, whom not only deals with these useless and premature mortalities, but also addresses the concept of moon logic, which means that one must be crazy or a lunatic to solve certain puzzles. The principle of never dying permanently has become a norm in the world of gaming. As much as during the golden years of arcades, the objective was for a cabinet to harvest maximum revenue in a minimum amount of time. Nowadays, the objective of a game is to complete it, no matter how many times we fail.
In the games from Lucasfilm Games, there can be moon logic, but generally the puzzles are logical. At the very least, they are less enigmatic or inscrutable than some of Sierra Online.
If it's not obvious, often speaking with the different characters gives us clues about what to do at a certain time in a certain place. Otherwise, it's trial and error, as usual. I must admit, however, that I never completed Monkey Island on my own before this time, for the purposes of this episode. I can't even say that I got very far without the walkthrough. I didn't know at the time what was important, that is, what I should take into consideration, as well as their usefulness. We were somewhat far from OPT Island, which I played so much that I knew not only where and what inventory objects were for, but also who was where and at what time. Still, I have to admit that outside conquest games like Civilization, point-and-click adventure games were once some of my favorites. With the advancement of technology, on the other hand, I started getting interested in car racing games as well as first-person shooters. However, I still enjoy retro point-and-click adventure games, and I'm still discovering a lot of them to this day.
I'll probably never have the time to play them all, and maybe it's better that way.
Without it being a record, my collection counts several thousand titles, games of all kinds, even games that I don't like. Each is an opportunity to experience something new. Above all, some of these games, especially the older ones, emerged from a very simple idea that turned into a concept which resulted in something called. Initially, the motivation was not necessarily a mercantile one, but rather the passion to create something while showing off. And the reception/review given to Monkey Island has been positive in all its aspects, although in retrospect this is not a surprise given the sequels and adaptations that were released. It's from its time, of course, but the game could have the same success today, even if the interface and/or presentation were akin to that of Fable.
Regarding replayability, like many adventure games, once you know the solution to the puzzles, it's like rewatching a movie you really liked and know the ending to.
There is no random element, or perhaps so very few. Everything happens in a certain order according to a script. In this, we are somewhat taken by the hand. Regardless, Monkey Island remains less linear than one might first think. For instance, the objects to be picked up do not need to be found in an imperative or even arbitrary order. Some puzzles can be solved out of order. What matters is that they all get solved in order to progress from stage A to stage B, and in that, Monkey Island is a point-and-click adventure game that works in stages.
That said, could we have done better for Monkey Island in its original version?
For the ST version, as I said earlier, we could have displayed more colors by redefining the color palette for some skylines during the vertical blank. I would have dared to add digitized sound effects just to add to the atmosphere, even if that would have meant having a fifth floppy disk and perhaps more disk swapping, although the game could be installed on a hard drive. For a pseudo-random mode, we could have had different possible endings which we would have reached depending on the actions performed during the game, let's say. Otherwise, I have no complaints about the game. Monkey Island is the culmination of all the principles established during the years prior to its release, with a good dose of humor. It's a game that, for me, is more aimed toward teenagers of the time, but it doesn't exclude adults or the elderly. It is above all a classic and a cult game that transgresses the differences of time and culture. No matter who you are or where you are, the game has an almost inclusive vocation, which is a tour de force, considering that a number of games had been banned in certain countries for various reasons. Monkey Island escapes censorship somewhat, and its content is intended to be light and unbiased despite the obvious caricature of piracy during the 17th century, which is a recurring theme in the history of literature as much as in cinema. Risky bet for Lucasfilm Games? Maybe as much as Pirates of the Caribbean was for Disney, or maybe not. The theme of piracy is also recurrent in the computer world, starting with Swashbuckler for the Apple II, or even Treasure Island for the Commodore 64, a sort of precursor to Zelda, let's say, but especially Sid Meier's Pirates, a game of exploration, strategy, and conquest, still as entertaining today as when it first came out.
This was today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please give me a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, to support me via Patreon, to join me in my Facebook group, to share this clip, as well as to let me know in the comments of your appreciation of The Secret of Monkey Island, or even point-and-click games in general. Finally, as always, if there are any other games you'd like me to talk about, let me know. The list is long, my patrons have priority, but I'll get to them eventually. I'm Guy from the other day. See you soon!